Good afternoon. This is Clark Neighbors with the final BIS market commentary for the month of November 27, 2015. Another fairly quiet, lackluster trade this week. Throw in the holiday with Thanksgiving. Fairly quiet for the week. Corn down about 3.5 cents. Beans were actually up 14 cents. Wheat for the week down 20. Now for the month of November thus far, with one trading day to go, corn is down 22 cents, beans are down 12 cents, wheat down 56 cents, and just for simplistic reasons, looking over 2015 year to date with about a month to go, corn again fairly quiet for the entire year. Since December 31st of last year, we're down 37 cents on a continuation basis on corn, $1.50 on the beans, and around $1.25 on the wheat. So fairly quiet market. It feels and looks as though going forward that will continue into the winter months unless something changes. Keep in mind, during the same time frame over the last few weeks, we've seen a nice rise in the U.S. dollar index back to above the par or the 100 value here of late, and these are values that we haven't seen other than earlier this year, going back to 2002, so well before we went to these new price levels in many of these commodities. Also, crude or the energy markets hovering down near recent lows again, and again going back to recent lows. You have to go back to somewhere around 2009 before you find levels equivalent to that. Now, the side note of that is that encouraging for the economy going forward, especially with retail sales here going into the Christmas holiday and the economic impact that may or may not have. Keep in mind the Fed's got a decision to make in December about interest rates potentially again, so all that stuff could have some impact on the dollar. So we have seen quite a bit of the long the dollar, short commodity type mentality or momentum in this market of late. And just to show you how quiet this market is, another thing just to compare, since the November crop report, one of the traders on the floor we talk to quite often mentioned that the November crop report was a sleeping pill for the grain markets for quite some time. Since the November crop report, the trading range for corn has been 10 cents, and for beans about 33 cents. And some of these weekly trading ranges, especially in the corn here of late, is the smallest weekly trading ranges we've seen going back 9 to 10 years. Now, getting to the cash market basis on both corn and beans has had a little bit of a steady to weaker tone here of late. Movement continues to be fairly limited in most cases, but we are seeing in some of the fringe areas or some of the outside areas where harvest is still winding down. There's some movement or decent movement enough to get some basis to show some weakness and so on. Now, due to the lack of movement, going forward, we would still think basis has some support. But the one thing that needs to happen in the big picture this year is the big supply in the West, where basis is quite a bit weaker, needs to supply needs, especially in the end user side, going east, and it looks like we're starting to see that rail program kick in going east, which is maybe limiting some basis levels in the east, and we'll see how that progresses going forward. So cash market's steady, a little weaker here short term, but over the next month or so, especially till we get to 2016, it feels like the producers' marketings are still going to be fairly limited. We had export sales this morning, and I guess one thing you would say with markets that are stagnant or lower is the best cure for low prices is low prices. And finally, we saw a very good corn sales number this morning, right around 80 million bushels, of which half of that is going to Mexico. Up till this week, the largest export sales on a weekly basis we've had so far on corn have been 30 million bushels. So a nice little uptick. We're still well behind a year ago. on corn sales, but we'll see with these lower prices, and we're more competitive in the world market now going forward. Maybe that'll have some impact. Bean sales this morning were 43 million bushels. A decent number for beans, but we're starting to see that slowly grind back. There's still big loadings going on in South America. I know at one point last week, a trader mentioned to us that there was something over 100 vessels of feed grain waiting to load out of Brazil. So, the world movement continues to be pretty impressive. As far as the livestock trade, volatility continues. It has mellowed down some this week. We saw a late firming of the cattle trade this week due to weather and lack of movement because of the winter storms. But negative margins on both the cattle and the hogs are something to watch going forward, not only for that industry, but also what that may or may not mean for feed demand going forward. Speaking of that, the only fundamental things to watch here short term, obviously, are changes in demand. Like this morning on export sales and corn, things like that to watch. The supply factor that needs to be monitored to some degree is the South American weather from this point forward. As of this point, South American weather is pretty good. They are generally a little behind normal in plantings, especially in Argentina. But keep in mind their growing season's fairly long, and things are spread out when you talk about when things happen in Brazil and when things happen in Argentina as far as harvest progress is concerned. Those two things, along with any changes in the U.S. dollar, any macro events that could have some impact on the dollar. Barring that, it feels and looks like we continue to see a fairly quiet range going forward. If you'd like to visit with us on any of these topics, feel free to give us a call in Cedar Rapids at BIS Commodities. Phone number is 800-373-2525, or catch us on the web at biscommodities.com. With that, I hope everyone had a great and happy Thanksgiving, and we'll have a wonderful weekend.